back. So, how many of you observed the eclipse? Okay. Some interest here. First time in almost 100 years that a total solar eclipse passed over the United States. I didn't realize that all 50 states had a slight effect of this. 14 of the states had a total eclipse, which is kind of interesting, that many. 2.5 minutes is what the duration of the eclipse was. And for the people who saw that, it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience for many of them. Although, we make it to 2024, there's another one predicted, so some of us will be able to see that. I was up in Quebec, in Canada, so I only had very little dimming mid-afternoon. How many of you actually went closer to the eclipse in order to view it? Anybody travel? One? Only one stellar adventure, okay? How many of you stayed here but felt it was memorable for you? Raise your hand if you thought it was memorable. How many of you barely noticed? Right. Well, there is a diversity of reactions to this. And when I decided to speak about this, which was back in May, I guess I assumed it would be, but I was kind of rolling the dice on whether it would be something worth talking about. Some people were very disappointed because there was mixed visibility everywhere. There was mixed visibility for 14,000 folks who paid to go to the University of Southern Illinois football stadium to watch the eclipse. There was a New York Times reporter who was there, Nicholas St. Fleur, and he reported that for much of the time the clouds were on and off, and it was making people very, very nervous about that. Good friend Emil Volchek, who was president of the Baltimore Society, he works down in McLean, Virginia, and he had a pretty good viewing. He's very scientifically minded, if you've met Emil, and so he became the de facto sort of tour guide with the crowd in front of his office, pointing out little things like you'd notice that the trees cast crescent-shaped shadows on the ground that if you weren't looking for, you might not have noticed that. He said that he also felt like the light in the sky made it seem like he was looking through polarized sunglasses. Did anybody have that sort of effect? Sort of a weird sepia color? No. Maybe you had to be closer. I'm sure there are probably as many different experiences as there are people. And that's ironic because that was a very communal event. It was one of the first times people got together recently and observed a natural phenomenon that was very moving for many people, almost primal. In fact, some people said it touched their animal nature in a way, brainstem activity. And certainly, Eric and I were actually speaking about the effect on birds, which eclipses have a great deal of. He noticed that the birds flew away before and then came back afterwards. Some of the research I did that this has been happening overall in birds. It's the most visible in some ways. National Geographic had an article about the eclipses, and it cited an Italian monk in 1239, Common Era, who said that, quote, all animals and birds were terrified, and the wild beasts could easily be caught. In 1560, the astronomer Christophe Clavius said how during the eclipse, quote, birds fell down from the sky to the ground in terror of such hard darkness. In Augsburg, Germany in 1485, it was reported that crazed birds fell from the sky, and bleeding flocks and fearful herds of oxen unexpectedly began to return from their pastures to their stables. Now, this is not superstition because recent observations show similar things. So you see that birds become more active early on, and crickets start to chirp, and dairy cows actually have returned to the barn thinking perhaps that it's time to sleep at that. When the eclipse starts, though, animals become very quiet. Bats and other night creatures come out. One eclipse chaser who saw an eclipse in Zambia said that as the sun disappeared, frogs began to making sounds. Raptors stopped circling. Giraffes started running. Some people have actually studied spiders who tend, in some cases, to destroy their own web at the beginning of an eclipse. No reason. I don't know why. But certainly these odd animal behaviors are rooted in the chemical and biological elements of living creatures. And anthropologists, historians say, we are no exceptions. We also are under the power of eclipse to a degree. In the distant past, particularly solar eclipse, have generated great fear in human beings. There's supernatural powers, perhaps, they think, orchestrating the event, or fear that the sun's not going to come back, without which the earth would be nothing but a lifeless, icy rock. The root of the word eclipse actually is rooted in sort of a fear. The etymology comes from the French all the way back to the Greek word meaning abandonment. Nobody wants to be abandoned, to be left without sustenance and support, so it shakes us to our core in some ways. One of the earliest recorded uses of the words was in 1375 BCE in Mesopotamia. Records written said, "The sun was put to shame and went down in the daytime." 500 years later, Homer wrote about Zeus turning night into day, hiding the dazzling sun, which created fear among men. The Greek poet Pindar wrote about a 5th century eclipse. God can shroud in a dark cloud of gloom the pure light of day. So around the world, there's also been a common explanation that the moon has been devoured by a demon or a dragon. Now, almost a millennium after some of these examples that I mentioned, despite the fact that people began to understand astronomy, there was still this tendency for fear to be evoked, or for people to think of an eclipse as an evil omen. Milton in Paradise Lost writes about how even kings were afraid when an eclipse occurred. There are records that Saladin, a military commander and first sultan of Egypt and Syria, and his armies had great fear when an eclipse occurred. And in such moments, people often feel like they are responsible for the change, which is why I think sometimes they slide into religious language. People do things to try to appeal to God to bring back the sun. In China, people pounded on pots and drums to try to scare the demon so he would regurgitate the sun and run away. In the historical record of China, there's also efforts explained to appease the malevolent spirits through sacrifice of oxen. In India, people thought that if they immersed themselves in water, they could bring back the sun. In North America, the Chippewa tribe shot fire arrows towards the eclipse in order to relight the sun. I love that idea. And First Nation people in South America were known to shout to the gods, promising that they'd work harder and they'd bring back the sun. Anybody do that? Of course, science saves us from this superstition, right? We know that human beings can't affect what NASA's website calls the sublime clockwork regularity of the universe. Scientific prediction allows us to check our emotions and allows reason to rule, right? So we've been told. Now, it fueled the growth also of an assumption of superiority that's so dominant in Western cultures. Wordsworth wrote a poem that reflected this attitude of superiority on the part of the Western rationalism when he wrote the poem, The Eclipse of the Sun, 1820. A part of it is, "High on her speculative tower stood science, waiting for the hour, when Saul was destined to endure that darkening of his radiant face, which superstition strove to chase with rites impure." Rites impure. This assumption that somehow the intellectual and moral high ground allows us to portray other cultures as impure. Scientific knowledge has been used, this is a bit of a sideline, but it has been used to control other cultures quite often. Noel Bonner, who was a writer who gave me a lot of material for this talk, gave 3 cultural narratives in his article about this story. The first begins with a potentially apocryphal story of Columbus, who was supposedly stranded on Jamaica. Anybody hear this one? I actually found it in about 3 or 4 sources. It might be true, but supposedly he was in need of supplies. The natives of Jamaica refused to give him the supplies. But he was armed with an astronomical chart that told him an eclipse was coming. Right? And this was a lunar eclipse. So he said, "If you do not do what I've asked, I will make the moon disappear." And then it occurred. And according to his son Ferdinand, whose diary records the following words, "The people with great howling and lamentation came running from every direction to ships, laden with provisions, praying to the admiral to intercede by all means with God on their behalf." A second narrative mentioned was that of Mark Twain's main character, Hank Morgan, in his book, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Again, showing the superiority of the modern mindset. He also knew there was a lunar eclipse, which was lucky because he was being scheduled to be burnt at the stake at this point in time. And so when he said, in fact, he would make the moon go away, the people were so terrified by the wizardry he used to steal the sun that they let him go. That's the exact same storyline as was in a childhood book that I read about the reporter Tintin. I grew up with Tintin books. Hergé's episode, Prisoners of the Sun, have Tintin captured by Incans along with his friend General Haddock, and they escape being burnt alive by Incans when Tintin declares, "The sun god will not hear your prayers. O magnificent sun, if it is thy will that we should live, give us now a sign." At which point the eclipse begins to end, and Tintin and General Haddock are free, and they're the king. So we see this tendency to sort of think of science as this thing that you can use to manipulate. We should embrace science. We should sing its praises, but I feel uncomfortable with those narratives because of the fact that so many first world people have been so abused and oppressed by so-called modern civilizations, these weapons to control people. Besides, this proud, almost hubris that we have is misplaced because although we might be able to predict the sun, we don't control it, right? We're dependent on it. We use it to channel energy. We use it to figure out when and where to plant our crops, which first world people have been doing in their cultures forever in very effective manners. We also use it to channel into electricity as well. And that's good. The energy industry certainly cares about the sun. The California operative, one of the grid operators there from the California Independent Systems, said that the August 21st eclipse really affected the power drawn on that day. And even wind power is lessened because solar eclipse at least lower the amount of wind that's being blown. So wind energy is less as well, which somewhat explains the weird stillness that descends during an eclipse. But again, we have to remember, it is we who are dependent on the sun, not vice versa. Sometimes we act that way. I want to return now to this question of the diversity of human responses. I think it's very well shown by the amount of activities around the eclipse of every type and shape. I think that reflects the diversity of human perspectives. Some people used it as an opportunity to learn science, or to grow spiritually, or to sell stuff, or to party. That's probably the biggest thing. A lot of parties occurred. Before, during, and after the eclipse, there were science expos and conferences, research meetings. There were craft fairs associated with the sun-solar eclipse. I read about gourmet breakfast lunches on the West Coast in very overpriced B&Bs that allowed you to watch it as you dine on your eggs. There were nature walks that observed animal behavior during the solar eclipse, and many Native American gatherings with music and vendors selling items. And in Lincoln, Nebraska, there was this total solar eclipse football game at the Sept Stadium. The first 3,500 paid admissions got free sunglasses to watch the eclipse. They had this celestial halftime show. Glasses were given out to those attending the minor league baseball game of the Columbia Fireflies during the, get this name, Total Eclipse of the Park game, for those of you who know the pun. There's a variety of guides to eclipse parties. You can go to the internet giving you different ideas to enhance these parties. There was Schlafly Brewery in St. Louis that had half of Totality beer with a very high alcohol content. There were marching bands that were livening up a lot of these parties, one doing a Michael Jackson medley for some reason. And in Illinois, there was the Moonstock Music Festival with Ozzy Osbourne as the headliner. Now, most of these events, I think, are driven to make money, but they also reflect that even though it was a communal experience for many people, we each took it in different ways, and so we had different avenues to connect with it. But it seemed pretty common to many people that it was a moving event. How many of you were at all surprised by your emotional reaction to it? Was anybody here moved by that emotionally? A couple of people? We're all jaded rationalists. A couple, all right. Well, supposedly, reporters are supposed to be a little bit more objective than the rest of us, but this New York Times reporter, Nicholas St. Fleur, was surprised. He said, despite months of research and reporting leading up to the event, I was wholly unprepared for the roller coaster of emotions in those fleeting moments beneath the moon's shadow. And maybe you had to really be in the totality to have that emotional pull. He was caught up in the crowd at the football stadium who began to shout in unison, "Move clouds! Move clouds! Move clouds!" But he did say that when he glimpsed the luminous rings the clouds parted for him to get a momentary view, he was literally shaking with emotion. This is an objective reporter. Now, many people do say that the emotion was because they were experiencing it with other people. One reason we get together Sunday mornings is to try to heighten our connection with each other and maybe say to ourselves, this matters. So to enhance that, I'm going to do something, just take a brief break. I know some of you, we don't do this normally, but would you just stand up for a second and say hi to somebody around you who you don't know? Or who you know fairly well. Just for a second, take a break. Let's bring the community together.
Yeah, I think that.
Head back to your seat. Thank you very much. One of the reasons why places of worship on Sunday morning have things like the sharing of the peace and moments is to emphasize the important connection between the emotions, the intellect, and the interpersonal. And I think that's something I want to talk about more all year here and try to focus on a little bit more. But let me turn to the eclipse itself, independent of the communal element. Can we, as rationalists, as science-oriented folks, can we still get caught up in the grip of the emotions that many of our ancestors did? Or does science explain away the mystery? The juxtaposition of the stories I told of the darkness of superstition and the light of reason are brought up by Noah Warner, who says, what power does knowledge have over terror? Does knowing how something works diminish its beauty and mystery? Or is the beauty of the world deepened by understanding the same things we see? There are plenty of people like J.B. Zerko, who was head of the Sacramento Park Observatory, who's seen countless of eclipses and knows science well, but he was very caught up in the eclipse emotionally. He said, he wrote of one eclipse, our motorized cameras began to whine and snap regularly. I look up. Incredible. It is the eye of God. A perfectly black disc ringed with bright, spiky streamers that stretch out in all directions, a few red prominences, a star or two, that fantastic object, blazing in the surrounding blackness at mid-morning. What a stunning sight. This is a scientist who lapsed into religious thought, which again brings up this question of what is the connection between emotion, reason, imagination. Mark Twain's character said, with a common impulse, the multitude rose slowly up, staring into the sky. I followed their eyes as sure as guns. There was the eclipse beginning. The life went boiling through my veins. I was a new man. The rim of black spread slowly into the sun's disk. My heart beat higher and higher. It was a noble effect. So, some people this August felt ennobled, felt inspired. Many called it a spiritual experience. And as I said, many credited God for this amazing show. Annie Dillard, who doesn't necessarily mention God, but does lapse again into sort of a supernaturalism, she said, this disco
sky slid over the sun like a lid and snapped shut like a lens cover. Abruptly, it was dark night on the land and in the sky, and the night sky was a tiny ring of light. The hole where the sun belongs is very small. A thin ring of light marked its place. There was no sound. The eyes dried, the arteries drained, the lungs hushed. There was no world where the world was the dead people rotating around and orbiting around and around, embedded in the planet's crust, while the earth rolled down. Our minds were light years distant, forgetful of almost everything. Only an extraordinary act of will could recall us to our former living selves in our context, in time and space. I didn't quite have that experience. But where does that leave those who claim to be scientific and rational? Can we have a vibrant experience over a natural event in a way that brings us inspiration? Do we have to fall into proud arrogance, looking down our noses at superstitions with colorful images? Can we be humble? Can we be playful still? I hope so. Knowing how an eclipse works does not affect how Anne Druyan, the widow of Carl Sagan, a scientist for many years, she wrote about this August eclipse. She said, think of it, we're born in some cosmic quarantine. Cosmic quarantine. Knowing no knowledge of what's going on in the solar system, let alone the universe. And every now and then there's an eclipse, or every once in a while a comet appears in our skies. This is the kind of inducement to figure out what's going on. To figure out what's going on. And when we do figure out what's going on, we can explain it rationally. But Druyan doesn't say it ends her wonder. She says she gets chills during such events. She says it even has a kind of mythic, biblical power. But it's not supernatural. In the rest of her essay, she describes it as informed worship. It engenders a sense of humility, wrapped in her appreciation for the fact that we can appreciate an eclipse. Aristotle said, in all things of nature, there is something of the marvelous. Now, I'd like to think that there's a moral in this story. This collective viewing of the eclipse, I wish it had sort of awakened us in a way to a deeper appreciation of our place in this celestial clockwork. I wish it changed how we treated the planet. It reminded me that this pale blue dot of which we are on, this tiny dot, covered by the shadow of a moon, is truly amazing and our time on it precious. 4.billion-year-old rock, 3 billion trillion tons, 93 million miles away from the sun, whirring through space is where we are. That, to me personally, not as an ethical culture leader, but personally, is what the eclipse meant to me. Some of you know that I'm an existentialist, and I love these moments where we say, oh my God, we are flying through a void of space. Let's make the most of our time. I spoke in my very first ethical culture address about astronauts having almost conversion experiences when they saw the Earth from space for the first time. People like Rusty Schweiker, or Michael Collins, or James Irwin, who were transformed in some way by the realization of the planet Earth in space. Irwin said that Earth, that beautiful, warm, living object, looked so fragile, so delicate, that if you touched it with your finger, it would crumble and fall apart. Seeing that has to change a person. Does it? You hope so. But a few weeks after the eclipse, we're kind of back into our old ways, aren't we? We haven't really shifted our consciousness in that way. We still pump carbon into our atmosphere at a rate that threatens our future. When I began at the Ethical Society, I was part of a demonstration that Nick Sanders and some of you others were involved in with 350.org. 350.org is an international environmental organization founded by Bill McKibben, by the way, who many of you have seen at local events here recently. It was trying to convince political leaders to bring down the amount of carbon in our atmosphere to 350 parts per million. When I joined the Ethical Society here, it was about 380, and now it's between 405 and 410. So things are still moving. They're going to continue to move, even if we do an about face. There's a lag time, you know that. But when we look at that reaction And we compare ourselves to the Chippewa who shot fire arrows, or the Chinese who beat drums to scare away the dragon. It makes me wonder, really, who is more intelligent? We know better, quote unquote, but we don't change how we live. If we were only as wise as our knowledge allows us to be, could we put aside our war with the environment? Could we put a truce on poisoning the atmosphere until the earth gets so angry with us that it begins to create hurricanes and great drought? Excuse the anthropomorphization of that. I don't believe there is a world spirit. But the planet is affected, and yet our leaders don't listen. Maybe it was naive of me to think that when I said I'd talk about this, that there would be this worldwide conversion experience. Everybody would join hands during the eclipse and walk out of peace and start poisoning the planet. But it does help me remember what I have most in common with all other creatures and all other humans. I've used this quote of John Kennedy's before. He said, "We may be different in how we treated the eclipse," but he said, "If we cannot end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we inhabit this small planet, we breathe the same air, we cherish our children's future, we are all immortal." We have to remember that we are not masters of nature, we are stewards of a precious planet that we call home. I hope we can begin acting that way. Thank you.